Hello everyone. This video will be my sharing of a list of spiritual teachers by their levels of light. So I've hesitated to share about this list or this map because, it can really trigger some people. If I'm trying to rank teachers in terms of how weak they are or how much light they have, you can see how a lot of people can be offended by that, especially if you're not going to make the top of the list. And you may not like what I'm trying to tell you. So that's why I hesitate to make it. But on the other hand, more and more I'm finding that this could be a helpful guide for some of you who are serious about reaching God, right? So because there is a graduation involved with this work, you can't just skip grades. That's what I found in my own journey and observing other people doing this work. What I find is that you cannot just skip grades. Not too much. You have to basically absorb every level of conscious, like the learnings from that level of light, in order to reach God. At least that's what I'm claiming. You're not going to want to listen to me if you feel like you've already finished the work, right? If you already feel like you're done the work, you're done, then I can't convince you, right? So I'm here for those of you who have some opening and maybe serious about trying to reach God to where I am. If you can sense some, if you can see that perhaps I've reached a state that others haven't yet. That's what I'm trying to reach in this video. So these are the teachers that I've personally also studied. So I'm not just sharing random people that I didn't really study or didn't really look at their materials. I'm sharing people that I've studied. I would say about at least 80 or 90% of their thought system and their level of consciousness. So that's why I'm sharing it, because that's how I know, roughly speaking, where they are and how close they are to Christ or God consciousness. At least that's what I'm claiming. So again, I'm not here to make you agree with me, because you might not want to agree with this list. Just keep that in mind, and you might be massively triggered by what I'm going to share. Okay, because this is why I've hesitated to share this, because a lot of people are not going to like this. But regardless, some of you guys might find this helpful, because, my recommendation is for you to study from all these teachers before trying to study what I'm trying to teach. Because most people, they have to graduate from most of these teachers before arriving at my state. That's what I'm finding, is you can't just skip grades. So anyways, without further ado, this is a list I've come up with. So, as you can see, I've ranked them based on levels of light and levels of how much ego they still have. So there's an inverse relationship between levels of light and levels of ego. So the more light you have, the less ego you have. And the more light you have, the closer you are to God, to the true God. So even though some of these teachers might talk about God, doesn't necessarily mean that they've actually reached God. I just want you to keep that in mind, because, someone like Leo, he talks about God constantly. Right? He actually talks the most about God, I would say, out of this list. But he's nowhere close to God at this point in time, unfortunately. So just because someone's constantly talking about God doesn't necessarily mean that they're close to God. I just want you to keep that in mind. So, some of these teachers talk about God, and some of them don't actually talk about God, like Matt Kahn and Marianne Williamson. They hardly talk about God. But their teachings are much closer to God, the thought system, which is largely about love. So, if you follow Matt Kahn or Marianne Williamson, they tend to have a focus about love. Marianne actually ran for presidency in the U.S. a couple times, and she was advocating for politics of love. Of course, it didn't go very far because, she's a saint. So, again, it's like this kind of consciousness is not going to be popular at this point in time. But Marianne and Matt are similar at level conscious, and they're closer to me, to Christ consciousness and God consciousness. And then I plugged in Vladimir Zelensky in there because even though he's not a spiritual teacher, it might help to bridge the gap between Matt Kahn and myself. Because, there's still a difference between Matt Kahn's consciousness and my consciousness. So I just wanted to put Zelensky in there as like a intermediary between those two. And then, there's Eckhart Tolle, Gary Renard. Both of them talk about Course in Miracles. So, they're also somewhat close to me because they're accepting of the content in Course in Miracles. And then there's Shine Murti and Osho, and Peter Ralston and Leo Guru. So again, this list is not meant for you to agree to. Just keep that in mind, because if you're a follower of one of these teachers, let's say, especially if you're a hardcore follower, you're not going to like this list, and you're probably not going to agree to it, right? That's not the point. The point is for me to share from my state of consciousness, which I'm claiming is the Godhead, where I think roughly people are, and who you have to still study from in order to graduate to where I am. Because someone like, Leo and Peter Ralston, like, you guys are not going to resonate with what I'm saying. There's too much of a gap. Like, that's why I keep saying there's too much of a gap. You have to graduate from these other teachers first, if you're really serious about this work. You might not even agree with these people. Like, if you're Peter or Leo, like, you might not even agree with these people, let alone where I am. So that's how tricky this work is. So, I want to share that because these are teachers I've also studied, and, I know exactly, I guess, where they're true and where they're false. So there's truth in what they're saying in all these teachers. So I'm not saying they're all, like, absolutely false. That's all I'm saying. There's some truth in what they're saying, but there's still, levels of light to be discerned amongst these teachers. So that's why I'm mapping it this way. It's really according to levels of light and how close they are to kingdom of heaven. And so I want you to consider that in order to reach God, you should be in this kind of mindset where you have to surpass every spiritual teacher to reach God. That's really the mindset you should have. Because how else are you going to reach absolute understanding? Right? How else are you going to understand absolutely everything? Because that's what highest awakening means, is that you understand every spiritual teacher, everything in this world, basically. Now, I'm not really talking about relative knowledge, because that's in the dream. Like, I'm not as focused on the relative stuff, like the Maya stuff. I'm mostly focused on the spiritual teachers. Because, you should have already surpassed the Maya stuff. Right? I'm not talking about that because that's not really relevant anymore if you're serious about pursuing God or spiritual work. So I'm focusing mostly on spiritual teachers. You should be at a point where you're confident about where exactly every spiritual teacher is true and where they're false. Now, it's easy still to trick yourself, right? It's still like potentially easy to trap yourself with false thinking, right? You can think of, say, someone like me. I'm just imagining Jesus. Like, that's one kind of thought you could have to dismiss me, let's say. So I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but it's more of a guarantee if you fully study these teachers. At least the more well-known ones, I would say. The ones that have had an impact on this world or continuing to have an impact on this world, you should have studied them pretty thoroughly and have graduated from them. And that I'm claiming that I'm at the end of the road. So, in order to reach God, you should have this kind of mindset where you have to understand every spiritual teacher. Not like literally every spiritual teacher, but roughly speaking, these levels I'm talking about. You should be at a point where you understand all these spiritual teachers. Right? Because otherwise you have some kind of blind spot. There's something you still haven't fully grasped or understood. You haven't learned, right? So that's what I want you to consider in this video, is what I'm proposing. It's because I fully understand these teachers. I've studied them. I read their books. I've watched their videos. Like, I was basically a sponge in this lifetime. So I don't know how you guys are pursuing this work. So I'm not saying you should just listen to me. I'm saying you should graduate from all these other teachers before reaching someone like me. That's what I encourage you to do. Otherwise, I'm just not going to be close enough. You're going to immediately just reject what I'm saying or what I'm trying to tell you. And there's too much of a resistance if you're trying to get to where I am. And the other thing I want to share is, that seems a little bit counterintuitive, is this travel of between masculine and feminine polarities that some of you guys may not be thinking about. So what I'm discovering, or have discovered, is that in terms of awakening, there's this trajectory, this counterintuitive trajectory, where you have to travel from the masculine and then to the feminine in order to reach the combination of two, which is where I am. Because where I am is, I can basically travel quite fluidly between the masculine and feminine, depending on the circumstance, depending on who I'm talking to. And that's how God should be. It's like, because it's like infinite. It's an infinite consciousness. So you should be at a place where you can travel quite easily between the masculine and feminine. But most spiritual teachers are not like this. They have like a bias. One way or another, they have a bias towards either the feminine or the masculine. But they're not quite combining the two, if you know what I mean. But to reach the Godhead, you have to be at a place, or that's what I discovered, is that you should be at a place where you can easily travel between the masculine and feminine. But in order to get there, it turns out that you have to go through the feminine first. And that's where, teachers like Matt Kahn, Marianne Williamson, and Eckhart Tolle, like, they have a more feminine-leaning kind of conscience, right? And people like Leo and Shanamurti and Osho have a more sort of masculine state of conscience. So I'm saying this is also kind of how awakening seems to work, is that you tend to go from masculine to feminine and then to masculine plus feminine. So I hope that helps to some extent, because I think the reason I'm pointing this out is that, if you're already in a more masculine, let's say, state of conscience, then you're more resistant to the feminine. You don't want to incorporate that into your conscience, right? And same with the other way around. If you're more feminine leaning, then you have a resistance to incorporating the masculine conscience. You know what I'm saying? So it goes both ways. Like, whichever way you identify, you have this kind of resistance to the other side. Generally speaking, most people don't want to incorporate both sides, right? They kind of stick to one side, whether it's because of their survival or their body, right? You have a body that tells you which gender you should be. But that's not how conscience works. The conscience, doesn't care about what body you're in, really. So that's the trick, right? That you're playing on yourself. Is that depending on the body that you're in, you tend to have this bias where it's one state versus the other. Not always, because, like Matt Kahn, he's in a male body, but he's still more feminine leaning. So it's not absolute. But still, what I'm trying to say that in order to reach the Godhead, you would have to aim for, because it's infinite consciousness, you would have to aim for the combination of feminine and masculine. You have to be comfortable with that. So this is something, if you resist it for whatever reason, because of your survival, or you have gotten used to being in one polarity versus the other, then you're going to resist what I'm saying. But I'm telling you that in order to reach God, you have to combine the two. Because that's what I've discovered, is that I can shift between feminine and masculine relatively easily. So that's another thing I want to share. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Again, it's not meant to be like me looking down on people. Like, that's not what this list is meant to be. But what I'm trying to tell you is that you should be at a stage where you've understood all these teachers at the minimum. If there's still something you don't understand fully, then that means that you still have a gap in your understanding, awareness, in your consciousness. There's something missing in your consciousness. That's really what I'm trying to tell you. So in order to reach God, you have to understand all these levels of consciousness as represented by these avatars. That's what I'm trying to say. Is again, you may be very triggered by what I'm saying here. It's understandable. But the point is to help you graduate. That's really the goal here.